A cold wind howled through the snow-covered forest as the night deepened. The blizzard had been relentless for hours, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the strongest animals had sought shelter. But out in the open, struggling through the thick snow, was a bear, her fur heavy with frost, her breath coming out in ragged clouds. She wasn't alone. Two small cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies trembling with every gust of wind. She pushed forward, her massive paws sinking deep into the snow, but she was slowing down. Her strength was fading. The storm was winning. Every step felt heavier than the last. She couldn't stop. Her cubs depended on her. But where could they go? The usual dens were buried in ice, and she knew they wouldn't survive the night out here. Then, through the swirling snow, she spotted something. Light. A faint, flickering glow in the distance. Her ears perked up. A cabin. A human's cabin. She hesitated. Humans were unpredictable. Some were kind, others not. But right now that light was their only hope. She took another step forward, then another, until her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed, her body sinking into the snow, her cubs crying softly as they nudged her. The light flickered again. So close, but still too far. Inside the cabin, Daniel sat near the fireplace, rubbing his hands together. He had been stranded here for 2 days due to the storm. No way to leave, no way to call for help. Just him, the fire, and the endless howling of the wind outside. He had always loved the isolation. But tonight felt different. The storm wasn't just cold. It was cruel. Then, a sound. A faint, muffled noise, barely audible over the wind. He frowned, standing up. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. Something alive. He moved toward the door, hesitating. No one should be out there in this weather, no human at least. Another sound, a soft whimper. His heartbeat quickened. Slowly he reached for the door handle, took a breath, and pulled it open. The moment Daniel opened the door, a blast of icy wind struck his face, making him squint. Snow swirled around in thick, blinding waves, but through the haze he saw something. A shape, dark and motionless, half buried in the snow. His breath caught. A bear, a massive one. And, his eyes widened, 2 cubs pressed against her. The cubs let out weak cries, their tiny bodies shivering violently. The mother bear didn't move. She lay there, still as the snow itself. Daniel's instinct screamed at him to shut the door. A bear this close to his cabin. A mother bear? This could be dangerous. But something didn't feel right. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots sinking into the deep snow. The cubs lifted their heads, their black eyes pleading, but the mother remained lifeless. "Hey!" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. No reaction. His pulse quickened. Was she still alive? He crouched a few feet away, his breath visible in the freezing air. The bear's chest moved, just barely. She was still breathing, but her breaths were faint, shallow. Hypothermia. She was freezing to death right in front of him. Daniel looked back at the cabin. Inside it was warm. The fire burned brightly. They wouldn't survive out here. His hands clenched into fists. Was he really considering this? Bringing a bear, a full-grown bear, inside his cabin? That was insane, completely reckless. But if he didn't, she wouldn't make it. And neither would the cubs. He glanced down at them again. Their tiny paws were raw from the ice, their fur stiff with frost. They had no idea how much danger they were in. He cursed under his breath, then made his decision. "All right," he muttered. "This is either the dumbest thing I've ever done, or the right thing." Bracing himself, he stepped closer to the mother bear, reaching out with a hesitant hand. The moment his fingers brushed her fur, her eyes snapped open. The bear's eyes glowed amber in the dim light, locking onto Daniel's face. For a second, neither of them moved. The wind howled around them, snow swirling through the open doorway, but Daniel felt frozen for an entirely different reason. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Then the bear blinked, slowly, weakly. She didn't attack. Daniel exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. His fingers were still lightly touching her frozen fur. Up close, he could feel how cold she was, too cold. Her massive body barely rose and fell with her shallow breaths. The cubs whimpered again, pressing against her, their tiny bodies shuddering. She was dying. Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen hypothermia before, had learned about it in survival training. If he didn't act now, this bear and her cubs wouldn't survive the next hour. "Okay," he muttered, mostly to himself. "I must be out of my damn mind." He stood up and rushed back inside, grabbing the thickest blankets he had. When he returned, the mother bear's eyes were still on him, but her body remained still. Daniel hesitated for only a second before draping one of the heavy blankets over her. The cubs instantly curled into it, seeking warmth. He had two choices now: either leave them out here and hope the blanket helped, or... He clenched his jaw. He already knew what he had to do. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to let something die when he could save it. He moved quickly. First, he grabbed an old sled he used to haul firewood. Positioning it beside the bear, he took a deep breath and tried to shift her. She was heavy, far heavier than he expected. His muscles strained as he rocked her slightly, just enough to roll part of her weight onto the sled. "Come on," he grunted. "Help me out here." The bear didn't resist, but she didn't help either. Her body was limp, exhausted. She had given up. Daniel wasn't about to let her. It took him nearly 10 minutes to get her fully onto the sled. He was panting, sweat chilling against his skin, despite the freezing air. The cubs scrambled on top of their mother, pressing their tiny faces into her fur. Daniel wrapped another blanket over them and gripped the sled's rope. Then, with every ounce of strength he had left, he dragged them toward the cabin. The first few feet were the hardest. The snow was deep and the sled was heavy, but inch by inch he pulled them forward. His boots dug into the frozen ground, his breath coming in harsh gasps. The wind fought against him, trying to push him back, but he refused to stop. 5 feet, 10 feet. The cabin's warm glow grew closer. 15 feet. His arms screamed in protest, but he kept going. Finally, with one last pull, he reached the doorway. He dropped the rope, gasping, sweat dripping down his face despite the bitter cold. He had done it. Daniel looked down at the massive animal, now lying half inside his home. The cubs blinked up at him, wide-eyed and silent. The mother bear barely stirred. Now came the next problem. How the hell was he going to warm up a half-frozen bear inside his cabin? He couldn't just light a fire next to her. If she woke up too fast, she could panic and attack. And the cubs, he had no idea if they were strong enough to recover. Daniel rubbed his hands together, thinking fast. He needed heat. He needed something immediate. His eyes landed on an old electric heater in the corner. It wasn't much, but it could work. He rushed over, plugged it in, and positioned it near the bear's body, careful not to startle her. Then he grabbed another blanket and gently draped it over her massive frame. She didn't react. The cubs, however, immediately burrowed into the warmth, their tiny bodies trembling less. Daniel sat back on the floor, watching them closely. Now he just had to wait. Would she survive? Would she wake up? And if she did, what would she do? His hand hovered near the shotgun leaning against the wall. He didn't want to use it, but if the bear woke up in a panic, would he have a choice? He shook his head, forcing the thought away, one step at a time. For now, all he could do was hope. The cabin was silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. Daniel sat on the wooden floor, his back resting against the wall, his eyes locked on the massive, half-frozen bear lying just a few feet away. The cubs were curled up beside her, their small bodies pressed into the thick blankets he had thrown over them. The heater hummed softly, blowing warm air toward the bear's frost-covered fur. Daniel could see tiny droplets of melted snow forming on her coat. She was warming up, but was it enough? His fingers tapped against his knee as he debated his next move. He had done what he could, brought them inside, given them warmth. But what if it wasn't enough? The mother bear's breathing was still shallow, her body unmoving. If she didn't wake up soon, it might be too late. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration growing. "Come on," he muttered, staring at the massive creature. "I didn't drag you in here just for you to give up." The cubs stirred slightly at the sound of his voice. One of them, smaller than the other, lifted its tiny head, blinking at him sleepily. Daniel exhaled. He wasn't an animal expert. Hell, he had never even been this close to a bear before today. But something inside him, some instinct he couldn't explain, told him he had done the right thing. The only question was, would the mother bear agree? A sudden change. Daniel stood up, stretching his sore arms. The weight of dragging the bear inside had left his muscles aching. He glanced at the fire, then back at the bear. Maybe she needed more than just warmth. Maybe she needed food. His kitchen was small and mostly stocked with canned goods, but there were some things a bear might eat. He pulled open a cabinet and grabbed a jar of honey, half full but still sticky and sweet. He stared at it for a moment, feeling ridiculous. Did bears actually like honey, or was that just some dumb myth? He shrugged. Worth a shot. Carefully, he moved toward the bear and crouched beside her. The cubs tensed, their dark eyes watching his every move. Slowly, Daniel twisted the lid off the jar, letting the scent of honey fill the room. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a twitch. The mother bear's nose moved. It was the smallest motion, barely noticeable, but Daniel saw it. His heart skipped a beat. "Come on," he said softly, tilting the jar slightly, letting a bit of honey drip onto the edge of the blanket near her mouth. Another twitch. Then, a slow, deep inhale. Daniel barely had time to react before her massive head shifted slightly. Her nostrils flared again, this time more noticeably. Then, with an almost sluggish movement, her tongue flicked out, brushing against the honey-covered fabric. Daniel froze. She was waking up. The cubs immediately perked up, their small heads turning toward their mother. One of them let out a tiny whimper, nudging her fur. The mother bear's eyes fluttered open. Daniel didn't move. He barely even breathed. This was it. Her deep amber eyes took a moment to focus. She blinked slowly, confusion clouding her gaze as she took in her surroundings, the warm air from the heater, the flickering fire, the walls around her. Then her gaze locked onto Daniel. His entire body tensed. Seconds stretched into eternity as they stared at each other. The bear's nostrils flared again, sniffing the air. Daniel's grip tightened on the jar of honey. If she panicked, if she felt threatened. But she didn't. Instead, her eyes drifted downward to the cubs huddled beside her. They were warm, safe, alive. She blinked again, then slowly, painfully slowly, she lifted her heavy head. The cubs immediately pressed closer, nuzzling into her fur. Daniel exhaled, only now realizing how hard his heart was pounding. "You're awake," he murmured. "Took you long enough." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't growl. She didn't lunge. She simply looked at him. Daniel wasn't sure how, but he felt the gratitude in that gaze. For the first time since this insane night had started, he allowed himself to relax. He set the jar of honey on the floor and leaned back against the wall, shaking his head. "Well," he muttered, "now what?" Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden cabin walls. The mother bear, though awake, was still weak. She lay there, her breathing steadier than before, but still slow, her massive body rising and falling beneath the thick blankets. The cubs remained nestled against her, their tiny forms barely visible beneath the folds of fabric. Daniel sat on the floor, his back against the chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He had done something insane, completely reckless. And yet, now that the bear was awake, he felt strangely calm. But there was still a problem. What happens next? Bringing a nearly frozen bear into his cabin was one thing. Keeping her here, figuring out what to do when she regained her full strength, that was something else entirely. He wasn't a wildlife expert. He had no idea how long it would take for her to recover, how much food she would need, or, more importantly, how she would react when she was strong enough to stand. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, staring at the massive creature in front of him. She was still watching him, her deep amber eyes tracking his every movement. Not aggressively, just observing. It was unsettling. And then something unexpected happened. The bear's first movement. The mother bear shifted slightly, stretching her front paw out from under the blankets. Daniel tensed immediately, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. But the bear didn't lunge, she didn't growl. Instead, she tried to stand. Her muscles trembled as she attempted to lift herself, but her legs gave out almost instantly. She collapsed back down with a low, exhausted huff. The cubs stirred, letting out small, concerned noises as they pressed closer to her side. Daniel hesitated before speaking. "Easy," he said softly, as if she could understand. "You're not there yet." The bear turned her head slightly toward him, blinking slowly. Daniel didn't know if she understood his words, but she didn't try to move again. He took that as a good sign. But the fact that she was trying to stand meant something. She was getting stronger, the warmth, the shelter, it was working. But that also meant that soon she'd be strong enough to move. And then what? Would she stay? Would she leave? Would she turn aggressive? Daniel exhaled, rubbing his face. He needed a plan. His stomach growled suddenly and he sighed. Right, food. He needed to eat, but more importantly, so did the bear. The honey had helped, but it wasn't enough. A bear her size needed real food to regain her strength. Meat, fish, something to give her energy. Daniel stood, stretching his sore muscles, before heading to his small kitchen. He rummaged through the cabinets, pulling out what little he had left. A couple of cans of soup, some old jerky, a few frozen fish he had caught in the river last week. He glanced back at the bear. Would she eat frozen fish? Did she even have the energy to eat at all? He decided to try. He tossed a couple of frozen fish into a pot, setting them over the fire to thaw. The smell of cooking fish soon filled the cabin, and that's when Daniel noticed it. The mother bear's nose twitched. It was small, barely a movement, but she had reacted. Daniel smirked. "So you're hungry, huh?" He let the fish cook a little longer, then carefully scooped them onto a metal plate. The cubs were already stirring, their tiny noses sniffing the air. Daniel slowly moved toward the bear, crouching just a few feet away. The cubs immediately perked up, watching him with cautious curiosity. "All right," he muttered, setting the plate down. "Let's see if you're ready for this." He backed away, giving her space. At first, nothing happened. The bear remained still, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, but then her nose twitched again. Slowly, she turned her head toward the plate, sniffing deeply. And then she moved. With a shaky effort, she extended her massive paw and pulled the plate closer. Then carefully she lowered her head and took a small bite. Daniel exhaled in relief. She was eating. The cubs, seeing their mother respond, let out small, excited noises and nudged closer, eagerly licking at the scraps she left behind. Daniel watched, feeling something shift inside him, a strange sense of satisfaction. He had never cared for an animal like this before, never been responsible for something so wild. And yet, here he was, feeding a bear in his cabin like it was the most natural thing in the world. The mother bear finished her meal, licking her lips slowly before settling back down, her breathing heavier, but not weak anymore. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching her. She was recovering. Fast. Soon she would be strong enough to leave, and that brought a new worry to his mind. What if she didn't want to leave? What if, after recovering, she saw this cabin as her new home? Daniel frowned, glancing at the cubs. They were already getting comfortable, their tiny bodies curled up against the blankets like they belonged here. If the mother bear decided to stay, would he be able to make her leave? Or worse, if she left, would she come back? Daniel didn't know, and something told him this wasn't over yet. The night was deep, the wind still howling outside, but inside the cabin a strange warmth had settled. Daniel sat near the fire, watching the mother bear and her cubs. She was recovering fast, faster than he expected. She had eaten, she had tried to stand. Soon she'd be strong enough to leave. And yet something about that thought didn't sit right with him. He had saved her life, brought her in from the storm, kept her warm, fed her, watched over her cubs. And now what? She would just leave, disappearing into the wild as if none of this had ever happened. Daniel rubbed his jaw, staring at the bear. She was awake now, more alert than before. But she wasn't just watching him anymore. She was observing him. The cubs, on the other hand, had grown bolder. The smaller one, the one with a faint white patch on its chest, was now wobbling around the cabin, sniffing at the furniture, nudging Daniel's boot curiously. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're getting comfortable, huh?" The cub let out a tiny, snuffling sound before flopping onto the floor. Daniel felt something strange stir in his chest, an attachment. He had never considered himself an animal person. Sure, he liked nature, respected it. But this was different. A sudden noise made Daniel look up, a deep rumbling movement. The mother bear was shifting again, but this time it wasn't just a small stretch. She was pushing herself up. Daniel tensed, his entire body on alert. Was this it? Was she about to turn on him? The bear let out a low huff, her legs trembling beneath her weight. But this time, she didn't collapse. Slowly, painfully slowly, she lifted herself onto all fours. She was standing. Daniel didn't move. He barely even breathed. The cubs let out small, excited noises and rushed toward her, circling her legs. The mother bear stared at Daniel. A heavy silence filled the cabin, the fire crackling softly in the background. Daniel had no idea what to do. If she charged, he had nowhere to run. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. But then something unexpected happened. The bear didn't growl, didn't lunge. She took a single slow step forward. Daniel stiffened. His instincts screamed at him to back away, to grab the fireplace poker or anything to defend himself. But he didn't, because she wasn't attacking. She was simply closing the distance between them. She took another step, then another. Daniel's breathing was slow, controlled. If he made the wrong move, everything could change in an instant. Finally, the mother bear stopped. She was now just a few feet away, close enough that Daniel could see the deep brown in her eyes, the rough texture of her thick fur. She exhaled deeply, her breath warm and heavy in the cold air. Daniel swallowed. "What now?" he muttered under his breath. The mother bear watched him for a moment longer. Then, to Daniel's complete shock, she lowered her head slightly, not in aggression, but in something else. Was it acknowledgement? Gratitude? Daniel wasn't sure, but whatever it was, it didn't feel like a threat. The bear then turned away, her movement still slow but steady. She settled back down near the cubs, letting out a low, contented rumble as they curled up beside her. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. That was the single most intense moment of his life, but it also told him something. She trusted him, at least for now. Daniel leaned back against the chair, staring at the ceiling. He should feel relieved. The bear was recovering. She wasn't aggressive. Everything should be fine now. But his gut told him otherwise. The storm would clear by morning. The mother bear would be strong enough to leave soon after that. And that should be the end of it, except it wasn't, because Daniel wasn't the only one living in this area. A few miles down the road was a small hunting cabin. A group of hunters rented it out every winter, and they weren't like him. They didn't respect nature. They only saw animals as trophies. And if they saw this bear, weak, vulnerable, with 2 cubs to protect... Daniel clenched his jaw. If she left now, she wouldn't last long. Not with men like that out there. He had saved her once. Could he really let her walk into danger now? His eyes drifted back to the bear, who was now resting peacefully with her cubs. Number this wasn't over yet, not even close. Morning came with a crisp, icy silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of thick snow. The sun peeked through the trees, casting long shadows over the frozen ground. Inside the cabin, Daniel stood near the door, watching the mother bear. She was ready. She had eaten, rested, regained her strength. Now it was time for her to leave. But Daniel hesitated. Would she survive out there? She had healed faster than expected, but she was still vulnerable. And the thought of her wandering into the woods, where hunters could be waiting, didn't sit right with him. The cubs, playful and full of energy now, nipped at each other near her legs, unaware of the danger that lurked beyond these walls. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was harder than he thought it would be. He had grown attached, not just to the cubs but to her. But he knew deep down, a bear didn't belong in a cabin. No matter how much he had helped her, no matter how much she seemed to trust him, she was still wild. And keeping her here any longer wouldn't be kindness. It would be selfishness. Daniel exhaled slowly before stepping forward, opening the door. A rush of cold air swept inside. The mother bear lifted her head, her deep brown eyes locking onto his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she stood. She stretched her powerful limbs, shook off the last traces of weakness, and took a step toward the open door. The cubs hesitated for a second before following her. Daniel stepped aside, giving them space. And then, without looking back, the mother bear walked out into the snow. The cubs scurried after her, their tiny paws leaving imprints in the fresh white powder. Daniel stood at the doorway, watching as they disappeared into the forest, their massive forms blending into the wild where they truly belonged. And just like that, they were gone. The moral of the story. Daniel stared at the empty clearing, his heart feeling heavier than he expected. Had he done the right thing? Yes. He had to believe that he had, because true kindness isn't about keeping something for yourself. It's about knowing when to let go. The bear had needed his help, but she didn't need him forever. She had her own path, her own world. And Daniel knew, no matter how much he had cared for her, he couldn't take that away from her. Some bonds are meant to be temporary. Some acts of kindness don't need a reward. And sometimes the hardest thing you can do for someone you care about is to set them free.